Krishna, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Facebook Live event. And the topic today that we're going to be discussing is going the distance, how to stay inspired in our practice of Bhakti Yoga. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Aditya Prabhu all the way out in Calgary. I want to say Haribol to all the devotees there and for inspiring this topic that we're going to delve into today. It's a really important one because we have, as devotees, we have a lot of questions that we want answered, particularly so we can stay enthusiastic in our spiritual life. And so hopefully today will be an opportunity for us to get into some of those questions and for us to hopefully encourage and inspire each other with different examples from Prabhupada's life and his experiences and from his books, as well as some practical experiences from day-to-day life. So what I will do is I'll start off with invocation and we will go from there. Om Gyanti Mirandasya Gyananjana Shlakaya Chaksu Unmitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swaya Rupa Kadamayam Dadanti Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuda Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Shah Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Rughat Anvitam Tam Sijivam Sadvaitam Saadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padahan Sahagana Lalitam Shri Vishakanvitam Shah He Krishna Kuruna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchna Gaurangi Radhe Vrindaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Turbhyascha Kripa Sundaye Vacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So just looking to get the blessings from all the devotees that are tuning in, and especially to all our seniors, particularly my spiritual master, that we can speak something that's not only beneficial for everyone, but also that's purifying for myself. So thank you everyone for joining us today. So this topic that we're going to be speaking about, which is specifically, essentially what the topic has to do, it has to deal with how do we go the distance, which means maintain our enthusiasm and our determination in our spiritual life and our practice of Bhakti Yoga. Now, we will be speaking from two sources specifically. We will get into some questions, but the two books that I specifically wanted to reference are these two books. First is The Nectar of Instruction, and the second is Bhagavad Gita. This is actually my favorite book, and then this is my second favorite book of Prabhupada's books that I've read, because actually every practical aspect of our devotional service are in these two books. And specifically the Nectar of Instruction. The Nectar of Instruction, for those of you who may not know, is specifically a book that was translated by Prabhupada, and it's written originally by Srila Rupa Goswami. And it really talks about the basic fundamental aspects of practicing bhakti. I like to think of it as a manual, and it's very prescriptive. It'll talk about devotional service in a very numerical way. It lists things out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's not much ambiguity, and it's quite easy to understand. It's quite an easy read, and Prabhupada provides some amazing information specifically about the different principles, things that can bolster our devotional service and our practice of bhakti, and things that actually sometimes make it more difficult. And for those of you who haven't heard of the Bhagavad Gita, so the Bhagavad Gita, most of you would know it, but this is actually considered the essential text from the Vedas. And the Vedas is a body of knowledge that originates from India. The reason why I say it originates from India is that it is the oldest scriptural text, and although it happens to originate from India, I always tell people that it's meant for everyone, because ultimately many people probably know that the Bhagavad Gita is associated as a Hindu text, and I tell people oftentimes that actually the word Hindu is not found anywhere in the Bhagavad Gita. And that should be something that's very encouraging, because when we know this, we can actually be confident that it is for the masses. And this very much ties along with the first principle of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is explaining to Arjuna that we're actually the soul and not the body. And so therefore, all of us, whether from whatever background we may be, from whatever status of life, whatever position we may have, whatever job we may have, that actually, everything, none of that actually matters, because the Bhagavad Gita speaks about all the various aspects of life from the point of view of the soul and the soul's journey. And that's ultimately what today's topic is about, is how all of us as on our spiritual journeys, we can continue to remain enthusiastic. So the first two verses that I actually wanted to point out, because again, this topic of going the distance and remaining inspired in our spiritual life, it really the main quality that's underpinned here is the quality of determination, how we can actually build more determination in our spiritual life. So if we actually, for those of you who have a Bhagavad Gita, you can open it up. And the first verse that we'll actually be specifically referencing is actually, it's going to be verse chapter 2, and it's going to be 2:15. 2:15. So Krishna says in 2:15, Yam hina vyatayanti te purusham pururushabha samadukam sukam dhiram somritabaya kalpate. So Krishna is specifically saying here in the translation, O best among men, the person who is not disturbed by happiness and distress, is steady in both, is certainly eligible for liberation. So specifically Krishna here, he's pointing out two very specific qualities that are needed for us to build our determination. He's saying sama and dhira. So sama means one who is equal or equipoised in all different situations. So highs and lows, someone who's steady essentially. And dhira specifically is referring to the quality of one who is patient. So specifically the two qualities that we need to really focus on if we want to build our determination is steadiness and patience. And Krishna specifically points those out in these two in this specific verse. Now, to counter that, in chapter 2, verse 44, if everyone who has a Bhagavad Gita wants to flip there, Krishna specifically says in 2:44, Bhogeshwara prashakta nam taiprata chetasam vyamisa amika buddhir samado na vidyate. So Krishna specifically says here, in the minds of those who are too attached to sense enjoyment and material opulence, and who are bewildered by such things, the resolute determination for devotional service to the Supreme Lord does not take place. So the reason why we contrast these two verses is that in this verse specifically, Krishna lays out the two specific aspects or traits that actually reduce our determination, Bhoga and Aishwarya. So Bhoga actually specifically refers to being too attached to material sense enjoyment or gratifying our senses, and Aishwarya, being overly attracted to opulence. So opulence has various, could have different connotations, But for simplicity, we can see opulence as being attached to too much fame, prestige, wealth, so these types of things. And these two specific qualities actually decrease or hinder our determination for devotional service. So these are two very good verses, I would say, to learn, to actually study, because they actually very clearly Krishna lays out what increases our determination, which we understand to be sama and dhira, so steadiness and patience, and the two aspects that actually take away our devotion, or take away from our determination in devotional service, is material attachment to gratifying the senses, and too much attachment to opulence. So I wanted to start out by highlighting these two verses because the Bhagavad Gita is an extremely practical book if we actually take some time to look at the verses specifically. I always consider the Bhagavad Gita to be, for those who haven't read it, I consider the Bhagavad Gita to be the original book on self-transformation. Many people today, we see a lot of motivational speakers, we see a lot of people doing self-help and different things. And if we go back to everything most of those people are saying, we can find all of it actually in the Bhagavad Gita. So it's a really practical book, and we'll talk about reading Prabhupada's books in a little bit later. Now, the second book that I wanted to just open up with is the Nectar of Instructions. So if you have a copy, you can flip to verse 3, because in this verse, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about different aspects of what we can do to remain enthusiastic and inspired in our spiritual life. And actually, all of the instructions are actually laid out in this third verse of Nectar of Instruction. So we look at if you have a chance to open up the third verse, but specifically it says here there are 6 principles favorable for the execution of pure devotional service. And so the first, we'll go through and talk about the first one. The first aspect here is actually enthusiasm. So this quality, what's referred to, is utsaha. So Prabhupada specifically, when he gets into this quality of utsaha, we all have to be enthusiasm to achieve anything actually, or accomplish anything in life. But Prabhupada, he actually goes a little bit further when he talks about this quality of enthusiasm. He doesn't actually say enthusiasm for anything. He says enthusiasm that's actually done intelligently, so we're actually using our intelligence, and specifically it's actually directed at something specific. So utsaha, enthusiasm for who? And it specifically says Krishna Arthakila Chaitasa. So specifically, we're having enthusiasm that's intelligently done for Krishna. That's actually the specific point, is that all of our Bhakti Yoga practices are actually with Krishna in the center. And that actually propels us to be able to do more than what we're actually able to do based on our own qualification when Krishna is in the center. So that's the first aspect of favorable principles for our devotional service, is enthusiasm. Now we can get into talking a little bit later about how we increase our enthusiasm, but one very practical way that we can connect just in terms of a practical take home is, first of all, having the company of like-minded people, so our like-minded association. So if there's people that we can really gravitate to, that actually we feel like understand us, if we have people that inspire us in our spiritual life. One of the ways that I was just reflecting on how I've been able to stay inspired in spiritual life is actually many things. This is becoming popular in all different aspects of different, even non-devotional activities, just generally in the world, but we talk about immersive experiences. So similarly in our devotional life, we should also seek out immersive experiences where we have a chance to go deeper into the knowledge, into the philosophy, into the practice. So, Prabhupada and the family of ISKCON, they've developed so many different ways for us to be able to do this. Sometimes people will travel to japa retreats. Some individuals consider going, there's many trips that people can go that are just for younger youth and different age groups to be able to participate, where people are together for periods of time. There's kirtan melas, but all of these essentially, I really, really encourage everyone to try to find an immersive experience where they can actually spend some dedicated time with other people, hopefully with friends and like-minded people, where you can actually have the chance to not only go deeper in the experience, but have fun together, because it really, really makes a big difference. And the reason I say that is it's not always going to be perhaps in the same city we're in. So I will definitely encourage everyone in their spiritual life, travel. Use your spiritual life to travel. It's a great way to see different parts of the world. And if you're with other people, other practitioners, other bhaktas, other sadhakas, then it's actually an opportunity not only to build friendship, but also to do things and experience things with always the lens of how does this connect to my devotional life. So this is actually, these are all different ways to increase our enthusiasm. The second way we talked about is having friendships. So deep friendships are really, really important in staying enthusiastic in our spiritual life. I know for me, it's been a cornerstone actually, is having very close friends. I've been really fortunate that I've lived in different parts of the world and made some very close friends over the years. And it's really those friendships that sometimes, when devotional practices become a little bit tough, we have people to help pull us up. And then there's going to be some times where they're going to, I have friends that sometimes they're going to actually hit a bump in a road in life, as, will happen to all of us. And then we have an opportunity to help somebody else out. So that's really, having deep friendships is really going to be important to go the distance in our practice of Bhakti Yoga, and also to increase our enthusiasm. And then the third aspect in terms of increasing enthusiasm that I wanted to speak about, that's really critical, and we can talk about ways of how to facilitate this perhaps in later, but having some type of mentorship or guidance. So this is a really critical aspect, and for all of us, if even just in our day-to-day life, it's understood that if you want to, any skill that you're looking to develop, you should always spend time with those that are further ahead, right? Because they can actually impart experiences, they can impart wisdom and knowledge that can help us do it much easier, much faster. And so guidance and mentorship is like that. It's basically helping us to navigate all the different thorns and pebbles that might be along the way, for us to be able to not only progress faster, to be able to advance further, and to actually be joyous and happy, which is ultimately what we're all looking for. So really this having guidance, having specifically a mentor, having a mentor really, for myself, have had a tremendous mentor, because I came in more seriously into Krishna consciousness when I was actually living in London. Although I was introduced to it as a child and grew up with it, became more serious about my practice when I was in London. And the first person that spoke to me when I was in London was in a Bhagavad Gita class, and changed my life in an instant. And that person has been my mentor ever since, and really has been really kind of a foundational piece, because in devotional life we talk about our shiksha and our diksha. So we have our shiksha is those that give us guidance day to day in our spiritual life, and our diksha guru is going to be one who actually initiates us, and that's one. But shiksha gurus or spiritual mentors or guides, those are many. So really make the effort to seek this out, to maintain our enthusiasm. And you may say, well, sometimes it's hard for me to find that mentor. Then I would say, first of all, you may have to look a little bit further beyond where you live, because for me, my mentor is actually halfway across the world, but we still make an effort and make it work. And the other aspect I would say is, if you haven't found anybody yet, then I would say, please try a little bit harder, because definitely if we are sincere about taking that guidance and that mentorship to maintain enthusiasm in our spiritual life, Krishna will definitely send someone. I guarantee. So that's the first principle that's really favorable, is this principle of utsaha. The second principle that I wanted to discuss from this third verse of Nectar Instruction, it says endeavoring with confidence. So what this actually means, endeavoring with confidence, being confident. So confidence that if I really make my best attempt to surrender, that Krishna will, his mercy is actually guaranteed. And so many places in the Bhagavad Gita, this point is actually made. And one of my favorite verses in the Bhagavad Gita is in chapter 9, where Krishna says, Kaunte pate janhi neme bhakti pranashati. He says, O Arjuna, declare boldly that my devotee never perishes. So what does that actually, when we think about that in our day-to-day life, what that means? For me, I actually always I was very uplifted, because it gave me a very much a boost, to say, okay, whatever struggle we're going through in life, keep fighting. But one of the things that Krishna is actually referring to in this verse, not only just, it doesn't mean we necessarily, when he says never perishes, it doesn't mean we're not going to lose in our day-to-day battles. We may lose, in our material, there may be some disappointment, that's there. But what he says, when my devotee never perishes, he always preserves the bhakti, the faith of his devotee. So that's actually, when we understand this verse at a deeper level, we understand that we should always be confident in the Lord's mercy if we're trying our best. So this is there, endeavoring with confidence. And in the Shastra it says, Avyasasa Rakshive Krishna. So it's understood that Krishna will surely protect me, give me help for successful execution of devotional service. So there's many, again, references to how Krishna will always help his devotee, help the sadhaka, help the practitioner in every which way possible. We just have to take one step, and as we understand, Krishna always takes 10 steps for every step we take. So that's the second principle. The third principle that I want to just quickly discuss is dharyat, or patience. So patience is actually really important, and this is actually quite a difficult. It's quite a difficult thing. It's not an easy thing in our spiritual life to always stay patient. But that's why patience is, as they know, patience is a virtue, because it's there. But again, if we're patiently and steadily, we said dhira, if we're patiently executing our day-to-day activities in Bhakti Yoga, our chanting, our reading, then actually we always receive rewards for hard work in anything in life. I mean, for those of us that are tuning in, maybe we're perhaps earlier in our devotional life, or maybe we've been practicing, but even if everyone can reflect back on school. For those of you that are working right now, most of us had to go through many years of school but once we've gone through years of school to get an education, then there's so many benefits that come with that. There's security of having work, there's stability, there's being able to provide for family. And so again, like even materially, to achieve anything, there requires a great amount of patience. And so in our spiritual life, we're striving for the highest thing. We're striving for devotional service to Krishna, which we know is ultimately going to be the source of all our joy and our happiness. So for that also, we should be willing to endeavor some time and be willing to work through some challenging times that may come ahead. The fourth principle that Rupa Goswami talks about in this verse is tat karma. So following regulative principles. So really, what that really refers back to is having a sadhana, right? Because we know that the 9 processes of bhakti are Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atma Nivedanam. So these are the 9 processes of specifically bhakti. And the great thing about this is that there's so many different areas that we can actually plug into devotional service. If one likes to hear lectures, that's their way to, that's can be considered part of their sadhana. If someone likes to do kirtan, that could be part of their sadhana. If someone likes to just remember, so reading, right? That's a form of remembering. Shravanam, reading is also a type of shravanam. Pada sevanam, serving Krishna's lotus feet. And then when we talked about arshanam, so many people actually have a lot of enjoyment and fulfillment. Serving the arshanam refers to deity worship or service. Vandanam refers to prayer. Dasyam refers to a devote, like specifically service. So the person who exemplifies dasyam is Hanuman, right? He was the representation of dasyam. And then sakyam, so friendship. Friendship is also, we can see that even Krishna says, that it's actually a bona fide aspect of devotional service as having friendship. And then Atma Nivedanam actually refers to specifically trying to surrender everything that we have for Krishna's happiness and his pleasure. And so essentially the point is here, the following the regulative principles, tattva karma, refers to having some type of sadhana. And sadhana means we are sadhakas, which means sadhaka means we're actually practicing. Practicing actually means we have to follow some type of rules and regulations. And that's why specifically in the Nectar of Devotion it refers to this process. We're actually practicing Vaidhi Bhakti. Vaidhi Bhakti actually refers to following some rules and regulations. Now, some people may say these rules and regulations we find a little bit restrictive. I actually would like you to entertain the thought that actually these rules and regulations, we actually refer to them as principles of freedom. That's actually what Prabhupada said, is that by following these regulative principles, we actually become free from so many distresses and so many things. And for those of you that have actually tried to adopt some sort of sadhana and follow these regulative principles, you can see definitely 100% how your life has changed so much for the positive. So again, this is the aspect of following regulative principles. And again, like just practically speaking, we talked about following a process. So again, with anything, with going to school, there's following we have to follow certain rules and regulations to get a result. A very simple example is when we're trying to, let's say, get some sort of driver's license. We have to follow a process of tests before, of tests and reading and studying before we get that. To get a citizenship or a passport, there's also regulated steps. And again, with all these things, if you don't follow some of the rules or regulations, then you don't actually achieve the results. So we should also here, to maintain our enthusiasm, also be willing to follow certain rules and regulations with a little bit of practice, starting small. We always say start slow, or start low, go slow, right? So that refers to just starting small and then day by day, increasing. But that, again, following principles in any area of life is key to achieving a result. The next principle is here, Sangha Tyaga. So it actually says giving up, or being mindful of our association and trying to be very mindful and careful, and even potentially sometimes even having to give up the association of those that aren't practicing Bhakti Yoga. And now the reason being is that we see every day people have a variety of different practices, different different things they ascribe to, different things they put their faith in, different practices that definitely aren't conducive for the practice of bhakti. And one may say that giving up the association of devotees or non-devotees, is maybe a little bit difficult because you and I, we all work. So, for example, myself, for those those of you who may not know, day to day when I'm not at the temple, I work as a doctor. I'm a pediatrician, and so I have to go to work and I have to interact with potentially people who aren't practicing Bhakti Yoga every day. So I think always the important thing to keep in mind is that we still have to be immersed in our day-to-day jobs, again, because we are doing this as a service for Krishna. That's also part of our service. But whenever we're looking at who our company is, we should always ask ourselves very key questions. The first question that I always think that we should ask ourselves is, does the company that we keep, does that tempt us to actually lose the principles that we are trying to follow? Are we being kind of pulled in the other direction, or being tempted to break necessarily the principles that we have? I think that's that's one important question. The second important question to ask is that am I, again, we should be very, again, outside of the company of those that are not practicing devotional service or Bhakti Yoga. We should always just be mindful of how much we are sharing of ourselves. So I think the general principle is we try to give as much of ourselves and our positive selves through what we gain in devotional service, but that we always try to keep very aware of what's coming towards us, right? And so by doing that, in the next verse of the Nectar of Instruction, it actually specifically talks about this point. What does actually this taking association mean, right? Giving and taking of association. One of the practical ways to think about it is how they refer to it in the Nectar of Instruction is revealing one's mind in confidence, right? So when we reveal our mind or share our heart, this is actually a way that we're actually we're actually taking association. So we should always be very careful of what we are actually disclosing to those that may not necessarily have, be able to relate to us or have our best interest, right? So that's the second question, is like, how much am I sharing and revealing? And the third thing we should really ask ourselves, that's really important when we associate with the company of those that may not be practicing bhakti or sadhana bhakti, is how much do they actually appreciate, how much do they appreciate us? How much are they open to listening? So many of the people that I continue to maintain relationships with that aren't practicing bhakti, they're actually people who actually genuinely appreciate the way of life that we're living as devotees. They appreciate the principles that we adopt. They appreciate some of the messages and the wisdom that we're sharing. And so this is actually a great thing, because if people are open to listening, if they're respectful, then we have a great opportunity to actually not only encourage them, but also try to assist them, and then maybe in different capacities that are outside of devotional service, maybe specifically work related, we can also reciprocate by trying to learn from them also in very, very specific ways, right? But I think that's always an important thing to consider when we're looking at association or company of those that aren't practicing devotional service or bhakti, is, do they actually appreciate my way of life, and are they opening to listening, right? Because sharing our principles and like what we do day to day, that's actually also a way of sharing our bhakti and our practice. And then the last principle that we're talking about, that talked about in this verse, is following in the footsteps of previous acharyas. So sato vrite. And so there's a famous verse, Mahajano ye nakata sapanta. So it's in this verse, it's understood the path to self-realization is following in the footsteps of great souls. And so that's why we have our mentors, that's why we have our gurus, that's why we have the acharyas, the people that have really sacrificed so much for our benefit. They've really practically shown us such a simple, practical way that this is actually a very critical part in maintaining our longevity, going the distance, is always trying to align ourselves as best as possible with the information that's been passed down to us from Prabhupada, from the acharyas, from our teachers and guides. So yeah, these are kind of these aspects that I wanted to share. And we talked about the importance of our company, like-minded company, mentorship guides. And I think probably the biggest thing to remind everyone of how, at least for myself, how I've been able to stay inspired in spiritual life is actually sharing bhakti, sharing Bhakti Yoga, going out and telling other people about it in some way, shape, or form. Now, one may say, "Well, I don't understand. I don't understand so much of the information. I haven't really properly studied everything." That's okay, because Prabhupada actually his intent was whatever you know, you go out and you try to share that. You first adopt it, you imbibe it yourself, you practice it first, and then as best possible we try to share it. And that doesn't mean that we all have to be out on the street distributing books. A lot of people like to just do kirtan. Kirtan is a great way of sharing our bhakti practice, because now again we see, practically speaking, going to yoga studios all over the place and people are wanting kirtan. So this is actually a very simple way, because maybe some people don't have the capacity for so much philosophy. But for music, and inserting that the Maha Mantra with the music, we understand, I explained this Maha Mantra, that this mantra, it's so powerful, it's such a powerful medicine. But kirtan, having the music there, what it does is we're putting the mantra in a capsule, and that capsule, the reason why we have that music is basically the capsule or the music makes the mantra more easy to swallow, so it makes it more digestible, right? And that's why kirtan is such a powerful way for us to engage not only ourselves but others. It's the most one of the most practical ways of sharing our bhakti. Something that I do for myself every time I get the opportunity, we should always either carry Prabhupada's books around that we could potentially show people that might potentially be interested, but even more so than that is always trying to carry some sort of prasad with us that we can share. Prasad is the most effective way to give Krishna, because what we're giving them is actually Krishna for them to take in and for that transformation to see. And maybe it's just going to be planting a seed for Krishna to grow. But as soon as someone's had prasad, their spiritual life has begun, right? I always tell people that once we have prasad, it's the beginning of the end, right? Which means the end is like, getting out of this place that we are, struggling in so much, this material world, and going back to a better place, back to the spiritual world. I give this example I heard back in 2005. There's a very well-known brahmachari monk, his name is Sutapa in London. He explained that practicing Bhakti Yoga or Krishna consciousness is like joining a team, he gave the example of a football team, so soccer, right? And he said that every day, what do you do when you're on a team? You practice, right? So Monday to Friday, you practice every day. Monday to Friday, you practice. And then he said, Saturday, what do you do? He says, on Saturday or on Sunday, you go out and you play the game, right? And so what he was saying is that, would you want to be on a team that practices Monday to Friday, and then on Saturday they just continue to keep practicing? No, because that's gonna get boring for all of us, just practicing every day, practice. Because when we go to the game, if we actually get beat by our opponent, we think, gosh, I cannot let that happen to me again. I gotta practice harder, and I gotta do better next time, right? Because then when we go into the game and we win or we're victorious, we get inspired and enthused to conquer and to do more, right? So we should see that our reading, our japa, our practice, our everyday activities of devotional service, that's like practicing. And on Saturday and Sunday, going to play the game, that's like sharing bhakti, right? So we definitely, it's not practical for us to just practice. The fruit of our actually practice is going out and sharing this with others in some way, shape, or form. Whether it be prasad, whether it be helping out with deity service, whether it be book distribution, whether it be doing talks and classes out at yoga studios and universities. One of these aspects is going to appeal to us. And really, I can tell you that and Krishna actually, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he actually says this very, very specifically. He says, Yara deka tara kara Krishna upadesha, amara agyana hana tara desha. He says, it is my order that you also become spiritual master, right? So that's a very, from Mahaprabhu, that's a very lofty proposition, but he's saying that he wants all of us to be teachers. And so for us to do that, we actually also have to take this practice really seriously. We really have to kind of imbibe it and ingest as much as we can. And then if we're trying even a little bit, it's understood that Krishna must help us. Mahaprabhu's mercy is definitely there to empower everything we're doing. All we have to do, sharing the aspect of bhakti and sharing our Krishna consciousness, sharing our Bhakti Yoga, it has nothing to do with how much knowledge we have. It has everything to do with our sincerity and our enthusiasm. I'll give you a very specific example of this. We met recently. I was actually in India, and I actually went there for a whole month. This is a good example of an immersive experience. I went to actually become a yoga teacher because I felt that this would be helpful in actually future opportunities and trying to share bhakti. And so when I was there, I'd been practicing yoga for quite a few years now before this. There were two sadhakas, Bhakti Yoga practitioners, and they had never actually, rolled out a mat and practiced yoga before, right? And in a month, they not only learned yoga, but at the end, part of our test was actually, we had to actually conduct a class, right? These two girls, these twins. And not only did they learn all the yoga in a month, but they did an incredible job of giving out the class. And it was just by, they absolutely virtually had no knowledge of the actual asana practice of yoga, but their sincerity was so tremendous that they actually learned yoga. And now they've gone back for the last month, and of all of us actually, even for those of us that were even more competent than them in actually the asana practice of yoga, they're getting asked to do so many different types of, they're getting so many opportunities to share yoga, teach yoga, and bring in that aspect also of bhakti through yoga, but all because they just said, they just wanted to try, right? So this is, for me, it's such an amazing example of just sincerity, dedication, and willingness, and their endeavor was completely, I see now, completely empowered because they're getting so many opportunities. And you can see they're inspired, they're inspiring others, and it really is such an amazing thing. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to talk about just really practical take-home points that we can have in our means to go the distance in our spiritual life. And so now what I want to do is start off and just open up with we'll get into the discussion part. If there's any specific questions, if people have, then what we'll do is we'll take the questions, I'll try to read them out, and we'll try as best as we can to address them for who they've come up with. You can just write them. So feel free, wherever you are connected from around the world, to just type in your questions into the Facebook Messenger, and we'll go ahead and address them. We've also had some people that sent in questions too, but right now let's just start off by addressing the questions that.
rules and regulations are principles of freedom. It was then when this question was asked. So maybe that helps you with the context.
So the question here is could you elaborate how these principles contribute to freedom? Okay. So that's a really good question. So we were talking about, so in the practice of Bhakti Yoga, many of you know that we have 4 essential principles. Now, these principles are actually considered the foundation of our devotional practice because these are actually considered, for those of you who don't know, these 4 principles, namely, we specifically refer to not eating any meat, no gambling, no intoxication, and specifically relationships that are, so no sex outside of marriage. And so for these principles, they're actually, first of all, they represent 4 qualities that are essential to our practice of bhakti. No meat eating refers to the quality of compassion for all living beings. We said no gambling refers to the quality of cultivation of truthfulness. The third quality, no intoxication, specifically refers to the quality of austerity. So what austerity means is giving something up for something higher, right? And the fourth quality that we talked about, no sex outside of marriage, refers specifically to the quality of cleanliness. So these qualities of compassion, truthfulness, austerity, and cleanliness, these are actually considered the 4 pillars of dharma, right? And that if we don't actually have these 4 qualities, then it's actually very, very difficult. It's actually considered virtually impossible to maybe able to make any significant devotional, to make any advancement in our spiritual life. So we should understand, first of all, again, these are 4 essential. They're 4 things that we are asked to do, but it's really important to understand why we're doing them, right? Because most people, many times, maybe we've even seen maybe we've seen other people, we've seen our own parents, and we ask them, why do we do certain things? But and they may not be able to know specifically, but when we understand why we're actually carrying out these 4 specific principles, that they represent these 4 very essential qualities, these are actually what separate us, as human beings with we're blessed with this intellect from actually what would be known as just lower animal life, right? And so the reason why they contribute to actually freedom is because we actually, if we see just very practically, we can talk about freedom in so many different ways, but we, just on a very practical level, if not consuming, for example, meat, there's plenty of now. It's a very popular thing now to be vegetarian, vegan. Why? Because there's so many different health benefits. So one consider freedom being having better health, right? The principle of no gambling. How does that contribute to our freedom? So, for example, we will, very, very simply, it saves us money, right? We can direct our money in more positive directions. It frees us from anxiety, right? A lot of people who are gambling are always under stress because they're worried about losing something, and they're always worried about trying to keep what they have. So frees us from anxiety, frees us from stress. We also actually keep what we have, and ultimately is for it should be used for Krishna. We talk about the principles of no intoxication, so that being an austerity. Why does that actually free us? So we know that intoxicating substances, they dull our consciousness. We can't think clearly. Our relationships suffer. We can get in trouble with the law. We are not as productive. We can't achieve our goals. And the most simple thing I always think about is that we have the freedom to think clearly, right? We have this ability to be we don't, like when we're in a social setting, we don't need to be dependent on external substances to blend in. We don't need that to actually to feel like we're being relaxed, right? Because actually, when we're not engaged in any of those things, we have the freedom of, we have a much better freedom of choice. We have definitely, we're sharper and we're smarter. And we have control over our actions, which are totally gone. So again, these can all be seen as things that actually make us more free, right? And then again, the last principle where we talked about not being no sex outside of marriage. This imbibes a quality of cleanliness, because it's considered unclean if we're actually having illicit relationships with many people. And specifically, it's very well known that actually this desire, this desire for lust, it's actually it's the most binding force that we have to our bodies, right? And so by even regulating this activity, Prabhupada even talked about regulating this this aspect, or like when we're also in household or life, that it actually has a way for us to rise to a level where we can actually, the mind can be steady, right? And so this is actually, all these principles, they're actually there to help make the mind peaceful, to make the mind calm. And actually, because that's actually what we're trying to do, the 6th chapter of the Gita says, this whole aspect of bhakti, when it's focused on Krishna, that's the only way that's the only chance we have to conquer the mind and to be able to understand what our real identity is. So that's, hopefully that answers the question on how the principles, the regulative principles, actually contribute to our freedom in day-to-day life. Are there any other specific questions? Did anyone else? No? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll actually go through some of the questions that we received. Let's see. Okay, so the first question was around how to navigate essentially conflict when we are in institutions, for example, specifically in temples. How do we navigate around, like how do we navigate through conflict, through disagreement, specifically within spiritual institutions, and how do we still remain enthusiastic through that, right? And sorry. So I think the first thing that we should, that's really important to remember when we are trying to think about how to kind of maintain enthusiasm when there are a lot of things that may reduce or like take away our enthusiasm. It could be people's behavior, it could be what someone said to us, it could be because of a disagreement between another, maybe there even could be a senior. And I asked a specific question to one of my seniors at one point, and they provided something that it's always stayed with me. And I think it's a very good way for us to look at specifically what Prabhupada he gave us. And it was explained that, for us to be able to go the distance in our spiritual life, we should actually, first of all, we should expect challenges to come, because we all have our false ego, and many other times, most of the times we have so much difficulty is because that false ego is being challenged. So the first thing is, if we can actually expect some challenge and not always just a smooth ride, then actually when the challenge comes to us, we don't get completely stunned and almost paralyzed, because so many times something disappointing happens to us and we get paralyzed for so long that we can't physically get up. So the point is if we expect some type of challenge, then we can easily just, go around it, right? So the first thing is, just knowing that we're in the material world and that there's going to be challenges even in the spiritual path. But the way we should understand that I was referring to is that we should always understand that we as practitioners of bhakti, we have conditionings, right? We aren't perfect, we make mistakes. And so what Prabhupada, he gave us this philosophy of bhakti, and this philosophy that's described in the scriptures, this is actually perfect, right? But the problem is that when we go to apply this perfect philosophy as conditioned beings, we may actually not even purposely, but accidentally misrepresent the pure teachings. So what's really important for us to do is that we have to actually separate the pure philosophy and the teachings of bhakti and the individuals that apply it, and that recognizing as individual conditioned beings that we all have a tendency to perhaps make mistakes and misapply. And once we're able to separate these two things, we'll always be able to understand that actually no, what Prabhupada gave us is such incredible, deep, pure philosophy that can work, that does work, and is so effective, but that when we see someone that may not be representing the philosophy properly, to understand that that's actually the philosophy that is not applied in its most pure way, and to understand that, again, we all have a tendency to, we're all conditioned that that there's the philosophy and then there's application of the philosophy, and that many times when in our dealings, specifically in institution, that the philosophy can be misapplied, and that misapplication should not be identified with what actually Prabhupada gave us. We should not equate the person and the philosophy that it represents. Ideally, we should always try our best to represent the philosophy as best as possible based on our capacity, but that we should understand that if we see an example or an example of someone that's not representing the philosophy, that it doesn't actually represent the original pure philosophy that Prabhupada gave us. And for me, when I actually was able to separate these two, it allowed me to be a lot more forgiving and understanding, and it was really much more of a mature way for me to progress in our spiritual life, and again, naturally go through challenges that are inevitably going to come to all of us. One of the things that I always think about, a lot of times we get information that not necessarily is going to be pleasing for us to hear. Sometimes people give us a comment, a suggestion, something we don't disagree with. One thing that I would ask all of us to do is to consider, when we're having this conflict with a particular individual or people or whatever it may be, is to ask us, whatever information's coming to us, first of all, is any part of what they said, is there some small truth, even if it's 1% true, right? So that's the first thing, is there some aspect of truth in what's coming to us, right? Because Krishna always, if we're sincerely practicing, everything is there for our learning, right? So the first thing is to come to understand what aspect of what's coming to us is actually, what truth is there in that. And then the second thing is actually, if we have some negative sentiment or animosity, and we also get into that tendency to perhaps find fault, that whatever we're looking for in the other or whatever we see in the other person, we should always look and understand what aspect of what we're trying to uncover in someone else is actually within us, because that's actually a really important thing, because generally in a conflict, we may not always have the ability to change somebody else. So we should always look and take 100% of 100% responsibility of our percentage of whatever applies to us, right? And this mindset is really going to be important for us to be able to navigate through difficult, sticky situations where there is conflict in institution, specifically in the temple setting that we may have to deal with. And again, always, when there's that challenge that comes to us, when there's that conflict that comes to us, we may have had a long-standing relationship on what positive thing has someone else done for us in the past, right? Because if we're focusing on something positive in them or something positive they've done for us, it will really help us in helping us try to work through the challenges or the mental blocks that we have. So it's really, really important to actually always try to see something, even something small, good in them, or something good they may have done for us in the past. So that's the first question about navigating different difficult situations in temple settings, in institutions. This question is coming, and it says, in what ways can one share bhakti at the workplace? So this is a really, really good question. I will just simply provide some of my practical things that I actually try to do on a day-to-day basis. In the hospital where I work, one of the things that I used to do, even when I was in residency training, I would always, because most of the colleagues that I worked with, they weren't vegetarian, and so I would do always my best. Everything that we were eating was prasad, so I would always try to give out, or at least let my colleagues and in the workplace try the food that we're having, and many of my friends would always say, they were very, very serious. They said, if you cooked for us, we could easily be vegetarian. So again, and I always saw that as an opportunity to, food is such a great way to connect people, to build relationship, build friendship. One thing that I do practically every Christmas, we have a devotee here. She has a business that she makes different baked goods. So specifically what I do is I actually always order from this devotee, and she does really high class cookies and different cakes and baked goods, and I'll bring it to all different parts of the hospital that I've worked in, the emergency room, all the different areas that I work with the nurses, and that's what I give as my gift, along with card and whatever else. But again, the point is that having prasad available is one of the most easiest and effective ways to share our bhakti in the workplace. So that's the first thing. And then above that is, sharing aspects of one's life, right? We were talking about, this is actually a form also of sharing or teaching, sharing this practice of bhakti. We share to people, what our lifestyle is, why we do this. Then people may actually appreciate it. If they're actually appreciating, and I've had even people I've had nurses come to me, or doctors, they said, we want to actually learn more about being vegetarian, but we don't know how to. So what do I give them? I give them books like The Higher Taste. I give them things like kurma, like Prabhu's recipes. And I give them so many different things that we have practically available to us. And they love it, because then they come back to me. They said, yesterday I tried this recipe. My husband loved this. My kids love this. And again, we're just taking very simply what we, have been doing for so long, and people are so appreciative, right? So then the second aspect I would say is that if people are interested even a little bit more, then they ask you questions, then you share more. Maybe you give people a book. I've given people books at the workplace for those that are showing more interest. And a lot of times when people are interested in some of the things we may say, and they may understand, like, where did you read that from? That's always a great way to share different aspects of our bhakti. Again, I mentioned just recently I went to India to learn how to become a yoga teacher, because now yoga is actually something that everyone is open to, everyone's learning more about. And you wouldn't believe that just in my doing this experience, people are just trying to understand. They want to understand more about their health. So I think anything we can do, practically speaking, for the benefit of someone's health, that we can connect people with bhakti in that way, will always be will always be something that's well received. So people are wanting to learn more about yoga, and yoga is really just a means by which we can then share different principles of our bhakti practice. So, but in general, what I would say is, anytime we're looking to share anything about bhakti in our workplace, we should always try to understand their need is, right? So some people, maybe they're just into food, so we're just going to talk to them about prasad. Maybe someone's just likes to talk about philosophy. Maybe they're interested in asking very deeper questions. So then maybe for them, we're going to just, maybe they're going to be more interested in books or talking about philosophy. Then there's going to be some people, they just like music. So then what do? You have some, if you have kirtan playing in your workstation, maybe someone overhears, they're like, hey, I like that. Or they might ask you a little bit more about that. Some people just like music, so then you just introduce them to kirtan. So the great thing about the practice of bhakti is there's something for everybody. All we have to do is put ourselves out a little bit to share aspects of our life a little bit, have them hopefully ask questions. If they don't, no problem. But trying to find where someone else is at and trying to assess, okay, what do we, Prabhupada's given us so many different tools by which we can share bhakti. For them, okay, this person has this interest, then finding a way to connect them accordingly or catering to their interest. Because the first principle in bhakti is that we do what we like in the practice of bhakti, and then as we mature in our spiritual life, then we actually look, hey, what does Krishna actually like? And then we do that, right? But first, we should always start by connecting people with what they like and how they can be able to relate to bhakti. So again, we talked about different specific ways, but the underlying principle is trying to understand where they're at first and then connect them accordingly. So that was the second question that came in. The third question that we have here is specifically this aspect that many times in our temples, the practices of Bhakti Yoga are the temples that Prabhupada have established. A lot of them have become very much centered around Indian people are predominantly the ones who are there, specifically Hindus. So how can we overcome essentially the aspects of our practice of bhakti that have become very much Hindu practices, and make them more relevant for others and make them more relevant for ourselves? So the first thing that I always, one of the things that we do here in Toronto is I help with hospitality and take care of all the guests that come in. And one of the things that I always tell people is that the practice of Bhakti Yoga, the practice of Krishna consciousness, it's actually not a religion, right? And the way I always, very practical way to explain this is that if we show people this, specifically this Bhagavad Gita, there's not one place in the Bhagavad Gita that the word Hindu is actually mentioned, right? And most people actually find that quite, sometimes devotees and non-devotees find it surprising because they said the Bhagavad Gita is from India. It must be the Hindu book. No, actually, there's no place where this practice, where the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita actually mention the word Hindu. So I think that's the first thing to remember, is that the whole philosophy is, this practice of Bhakti Yoga is actually the original practice of Sanatan Dharma, right? Sanatan means eternal. Dharma means a way of being, right? So Sanatan Dharma means the eternal way of being for every living entity, not just those people that were from India. So these teachings were originally meant for everyone. The Vedas were originally meant for everyone. Because Krishna says that in this Bhagavad Gita, what does he say? He says, I am actually the Adhyatma Vidya Vidyanam. He's like, this is the spiritual science of the self, right? In the 10th chapter, Krishna actually says this specific thing. And so we should understand that first and foremost, that even though we may be surrounded by those that appreciate the practice of Bhakti Yoga and Krishna consciousness, maybe Indian, we should always understand in our mind they're actually meant for a much wider audience, right? And then the very practical thing to help kind of move, to get us around this, is that we actually need to educate, right? We actually need to, this was actually something that I was very recently discussing when my Shishika Guru was here in Toronto. We were discussing that, trying to kind of change culture. He says, he was discussing this aspect of education. Not only do we have to educate the public that are coming from outside, we actually have to even educate our own our own congregation, our own practitioners, our own devotees, about really going back to the basics, right? And that the back to the basics really means is that this element of compassion that Prabhupada was showing, the essential point of this element of compassion is trying to share it with other people, and that we have to do whatever it takes to make it relevant to the general, to the local people that come and visit. And then again, the other way to really help us make us feel more comfortable about our practice and reach out to a totally different group of people that we are looking to bring in a new set of people is maybe sometimes it's useful to start outside the temple, right? So one of the endeavors that we're doing here in Toronto is that we've set up this group called Kirtan Toronto, and actually what that is actually we're taking Kirtan and this practice of bhakti, and we're doing it outside of the temple in a very neutral setting. So it allows people to come who may not necessarily come to the temple, but they're happy to come to this setting, and we have Kirtan, we have Prasad, we have some sort of discussion. So think about having events potentially outside of the temple setting, and that when people eventually come to a certain stage, maybe then we connect them to the temple. So that was the second question that came forward, was just how to deal with this aspect. The third question, which is actually a really important. Someone asked this question of I'll just read it out, is as we are all relatively new to the practice of Bhakti Yoga, we often make mistakes. And these mistakes can essentially leave us feeling discouraged, and we have to, a lot of times what happens is we develop guilt, and we say, well, what's the point anyways? So how do we actually rise above this and inspire ourselves despite these continuous mistakes? And I was reflecting on this, and so I think the first point to actually remember is that as conditioned beings, the Vedic text, it talks about that actually we all, as conditioned beings, we have 4 defects, right? And so if you remember, if you can probably remember if you don't remember what these 4 defects are, we'll go through them. So the first one is karana patva, so imperfect senses. So that means that the senses are limited and that they can be misled. The second defect that we have is that we fall under pramada, or illusion, right? That we can actually, we accept as what is not real is real. The third is we make mistakes. So many people have heard the expression, to err is human. And the last one is that as humans, we have this condition to cheat. And so we have a tendency to take shortcuts. I always laughed when I heard one brahmachari, he says, Kali Yuga is like the shortcut yuga, right? We're always looking for where's the shortcut, where can we cut corners, right? And I thought this is so true. We're always looking for the easy way out. So the reason I bring up these 4 defects is first of all, just to acknowledge that actually if we understand that making mistakes is part of the process, then we're actually, then there's no problem, right? That we actually, first of all, acknowledge that, we make mistakes, and that is okay. I like to think of sometimes guilt is good to the point where it's healthy. I consider healthy guilt is one that actually promotes humility. So we actually realize that we're actually in a difficult position, that surviving in this material world is not easy. But then from that very point of realizing our position, we work really, really hard to rise above, and then we actually are not only endeavoring with our best effort, but we're relying on Krishna's grace, Krishna's mercy at the same time. And so, again, this whole aspect of trying to stay inspired, we should always look at mistakes they can be taken in two directions, right? Are we learning from our mistakes, or do we keep making the same mistakes over and over again? Now that obviously, if we really wanted to look at it from why are we continuing to make the same mistakes, the positive way to look at it is that actually Krishna is giving us the opportunity to learn again, right? So we should continually ask ourselves, what is the lesson? And we are continuing to make the same mistakes. What is a lesson that we should be learning from this situation, because it keeps coming back, right? And so that requires some self-awareness, some reflection. But that the best position always to be is to seek the opportunity, right? To always have the vision of where is the opportunity to, the vision to actually grow and to develop from a specific mistake. Because if we have that mindset, then every situation, every challenge, every difficulty, every mistake will always be an opportunity to springboard and propel our way forward in our devotional life. So hopefully that's specific. I just wanted to see. So again, just talking about this area of guilt. If we actually don't get up and try again, then actually we're actually minimizing Krishna's position in our life, because Krishna, he can actually uplift us as much as we want. He just wants us to see our effort, and again, we should recognize that so many things in our spiritual life, they're going to be difficult to do without the Lord's mercy and the Lord's grace. So just by getting up and trying, we actually are doing our part, right? And that if we're doing our part, we actually, the proper conscience is that we can hope and we can expect that Krishna is going to help us if we're giving our best effort. So this is actually a very enthusing way to look at mistakes. Is that because in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna specifically asks, he's like, what happens to that person who continues endeavors but doesn't make it, right? And Krishna says is that if someone is continuously like trying, he says I consider that person still, even if they're making mistakes, that person is still properly situated because they've gotten up and they've tried, right? Even anyone who's pursuing our day-to-day material endeavor, the motivational speaker will say, it's not about how many times we fall down, it's about how many times we get up and keep going, right? So that's actually the key, is we may have so many times that we've fallen down, but to have a chance, all we have to do is get up, right? All we have to do sometimes is show up. All we have to do is pick up those beads, and all we have to do is maybe open up that book and try reading, or going to the temple and meeting up with a friend. And I can definitely assure you that just by these small little attempts to try, that guaranteed we will get that enthusiasm we're looking for, we will get that upliftment, and we will get that encouragement to keep us going. So again, like with everything else, if we are having that challenge, always I say start small, start small, but start now. And then, start low, go slow, right? So again, very easy things to remember, to just take bite-sized pieces and work our way up. So that was another question that came to us. One of the things that I always think about when we think about this, and spiritual life, we're not minimizing and saying that Bhakti Yoga, this practice of Bhakti Yoga, is going to be a walk in the park. And I'll reflect back on what Prabhupada said. He says, spiritual life is difficult. It is difficult, but material life is impossible, right? Prabhupada always said this. He's like, spiritual life is difficult, but material life is impossible. So we should really focus on this. And that even so many different, we understand, even when we look, to make ourselves even a little bit comforted by the fact that we're having challenges and we're making mistakes, we look at even the Bhagavatam, the Mahajans, the great souls that are described in Bhagavatam, even they became distracted, even they make mistakes. We see so many times Indra, he made offenses, king of the demigods. Shiva, he got distracted, Mohini Murti, and he actually got distracted from his meditation. Brahma, he was also, there are examples where he gets distracted, and so many different great souls we see have challenge. And Krishna says that Maya is very strong, and the only way to actually overcome this external energy of the Lord's is to actually make an attempt to surrender. So again, we can derive a lot of solace in knowing that we may be making mistakes, but Krishna is still willing to accept whatever effort we're trying to make. So still continue to encourage ourselves, put ourselves in the right company, seek some advice and guidance from seniors, but just keep going. So that's the next question, and then we had a couple more questions that came through. Okay, so the next question is when engaging in service with others, people, there are disagreements between groups, or if everyone is not on the same understanding, how can we maneuver ourselves through these situations and still uphold the attitude of service and not let our sadhana be affected in these situations? So I think we addressed an aspect of that before, but I think the very, very important principle to remember in this specific context with this specific question is that as practitioners of Bhakti Yoga, we should always take the opportunity to, the principle is seek to understand before one is understood, right? So many times we always look at conflict and say that person didn't understand me, or I don't feel understood, or someone did something to me, right? So the first principle, as those of us who are trying to practice Bhakti, who are trying to be of service, is taking the first step to try to understand where someone else is coming from, right? So the first principle is first to understand. The second, in this process of understanding, we talked about before, trying to understand what they may be saying that could be helpful, trying to extract something there that is positive. I think, again, this principle of seeking the essence, seeking the essence of what someone's trying to give us, because most of the times what happens in our day-to-day interactions with other devotees, other practitioners, it's not actually what they're saying, it's how it's said, right? So that actually a principle applies to us, is that if we're trying to also help people, to encourage people, to give feedback, to correct somebody, we should always be understanding that, to be honest, we can actually, for most people, we can actually say, most people do have the capacity to accept so many things, but we should always be very careful about how we're saying this, right? And Bhagavad Gita specifically addresses this in the 17th chapter. The austerity speech, it specifically addresses speaking in a way that's beneficial, pleasing, and not agitating to somebody, right? So this aspect of not agitating, it also requires some meditation on how to do this best, right? Maybe we're not going to be the person to necessarily deal with that specific individual group of people. Maybe we need to find someone else who's closer to them, who has a better relationship with them. But I think it is very important, first of all, to understand that there are going to be disagreements, and that's why Prabhupada specifically said, he says, the greatest service that one can do to me is to actually cooperate with each other, right? And so this principle of cooperation, Prabhupada, he stressed so much, because he knew, naturally, in Kali Yuga, we're in this yuga of quarrel and hypocrisy. That is actually baseline, standard, normal. So as devotees, if we know this is the case, then we should actually try to adopt
a mindset that we're trying to actually rise above this. And that first of all means, again, like expecting a little bit of challenge. Second, trying to see, trying to understand, and before we're understood. And then the third element is trying to seek out what element of truth someone is speaking, what element applies to us, and what element is actually positive in the suggestion or feedback that's coming that we can actually use. And again, by keeping this mindset, we'll always be in a mindset of trying to grow. And again, having a strong sadhana actually helps us through these disagreements, actually helps us through misunderstandings. Because we know that this chanting of this Maha Mantra, what is it doing? Cheto Darpana Marjanam. It's actually cleansing the mirror of the mind, this heart that's full of dust, these anarthas that have been accumulated for so many different lifetimes, right? So that, knowing that we have a steady sadhana, which means, trying to do something small every day, we'll know that actually the disagreements, the misunderstandings, yes, they're coming, but we're actually empowering ourselves to be in the best position by having a regular sadhana to be able to work through this. And that regular sadhana also will include taking some time daily to read Prabhupada's books, because really this is the best way for us to associate with Prabhupada. It is the best way to hear. I mean, we can physically listen, but reading is also a way. But it really helps reading these books. One of the reasons I took examples out of the books is because I want us to develop the faith that actually everything we're looking for, all the answers we're looking for, they're actually in Prabhupada's books. We just have to take the time to actually study them, to read them, to discuss them with each other, and then to try to apply them. So this also will help us, by reading this information, give us the information, so many things, so many answers to the questions we have. The answers are there in the Bhagavatam, in the Bhagavad Gita. How do we navigate these sensitive points? The Mahajans, they went through different things. All the problems that they went through are actually problems that apply to us. We just have to go to the books to look for the answers and see how they navigated through things. So that was another question that came through. The last question is, how do we try to stay inspired and encouraged when people may not support programs that we're conducting in a temple, or when we aren't feeling supported in our different service initiatives? So the really important aspect to, some of the things that are important to remember here is that it is actually a reality that we are going to run into devotees that may not encourage us or support us, and they may be our seniors. But I think the first thing to remember is that, first of all, it's important to have friends who encourage us. Ideally, we have also seniors that are our fans, that are encouraging us and supporting us. They may not be the people that specifically who we are directly serving under, but it's always important to have, I call them fans, whether it be friends or seniors that are continuously encouraging us. I think that's really important to have. To remember different quotes from the different scriptures or shastras, or quotes from Prabhupada, or spiritual masters or guides. Remembering quotes in those situations also help us work through and help us stay inspired, especially when things get really difficult. So having some things that we readily remember very easily for us. We talked about having some type of sadhana. And then really, the other really important thing to remember is that maybe when we're not feeling support, we may have to look at who are the people that are supporting us, right? Maybe they're going to be the people that I'm going to be serving with. So I think it's really, really important that when we're trying to stay encouraged and inspired, and we may not be getting the support we need, first of all, we should always look to seniors that are supporting us. Can they support us in our endeavor? second of all, are those seniors in a place where they can talk to the people that may not be supporting us, because maybe they're going to serve as a bridge to help us, right? And then the other aspect is, if, very practically speaking, some very tremendous successful projects within Prabhupada's movement actually have started maybe outside of the temple setting. So again, we sometimes don't always get the encouragement support we have necessarily within the temple setting, then we just very easily we can step out. Always be respectful to our seniors. I think that's always important. But always, if there are people that are supporting us, get the support to do something, perhaps potentially outside of the temple setting. So yeah, those are some specific. Questions that came up. I guess what I wanted to ask for anybody that's listening: are there any other questions that have come up? Anything that I said that you didn't understand, or is there anything that specifically people want to add about certain things they may have found like helpful, certain things that they potentially took out of the session that they will apply? Feel free, at this time to share anything. Oh, so sorry, we have one more question here. This is a really good question. So the question here is how to make sure that patience does not turn into hopelessness. So this is a really good question, because I think generally it's a very valid point, because you're likely saying that I've been waiting. Maybe what you're feeling is that I've been waiting for so long, and maybe something hasn't changed, or maybe I haven't been able to work through something. So I think what's really important there in this specific situation is, do we have some sort of mentorship or guidance or a mentor in our life to help us work through? Because these are the types of times that if you're feeling this way, that we should actually seek some guidance and some counsel from those that are more advanced than us, those that have traversed the path, and to actually see, and very realistically ask this question: have I been patient for long enough? Is something going to change, or has this just become a hopeless situation, right? And we're, as devotees, we're always hopeful. Why? Because we're actually serving Krishna, and Krishna can change the situation at any given moment. But we should always be realistic. Realistic is, a very important part of maturing in our devotional life. So the first thing that I would say is, when we're trying to decipher between patience and this feeling of hopelessness, is trying to get some guidance from mentors and seniors. I think the second really important aspect of it is, have we tried our best in whatever the situation may be? And if you're at the point where you feel like you've tried your best, then we actually have to look around us and see, ultimately, the principle is always in our spiritual life, save ourselves, right? So we can't actually help anybody in our spiritual life if we're actually feeling hopeless ourselves. When we're on a plane, generally what is always a principle at the beginning of the plane is that we always put our oxygen mask first before we put on the mask of someone else, a child who may be beside us. Because that principle is there. First, we have no chance of helping ourselves. And the reason I'm bringing this point up is that perhaps whatever we're trying to work through, if it can't be specifically done in that specific context, then outside of trying our best and prayer, which if you're doing, that's tremendous, and if we have getting the proper guidance, then we may need to move into a different situation or move into a different location that actually may facilitate our upliftment, our devotional service. so that we don't fall into that, that in reality we may not continue to feel like we're in that state of feeling hopeless, right? Because patience is always there, it's important, right? But we should always consider that in the context of if we've tried our best, if we're having guidance, if we have done whatever we can in a specific situation, if we have been patient, then we should always look around potentially what other situation may be the best for us to thrive and to be enthused. So that, I would say, is a start to that question. Now, obviously, every specific situation will have different, we say kala, desha, patra, so time, place, and circumstance. So specific advice, we would have to know the specific situation. But I think focusing on these three principles are really going to help us to know when our patience has crossed the threshold where it's then become more, then essentially just beyond our capacity, where we need to kind of change the situation to continue on and be enthusiastic in our spiritual life. So I think if that is it. So if there are no more comments or questions, if there are, please just put them through right now. But if there's no more comments or questions, I want to thank everyone for joining us on our Facebook Live event today on the topic of going the distance, how to stay inspired and enthused in our practice of Bhakti Yoga. I want to thank everyone today for joining us. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them after the session. I'll still be able to check and try to answer questions. Feel free to look myself up on Facebook, Raseshwar Madhava, and we'll try to answer questions. And also for those that have connected to Aditya in any way, he has the ability to give out my contact information if you have any more specific questions that you want to take offline. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna.